Hello, everyone. This is BL Confession Room, a channel dedicated to telling forbidden BL stories that will leave you speechless. This is the story of an Omega teacher who thinks his students are just gifted boys from wealthy families, until a royal reception turns into a live scandal and a child prince clings to him and calls him father in front of every camera in the country. Support the channel with a like and a subscription so you don't miss new forbidden BL stories, and write which city you're watching from. Julian Hart had never trusted official events. The floors were always too polished, the smiles too controlled, the applause too perfectly timed. He had agreed to the palace reception only because St. Aurelian Academy framed it as a necessity. A teacher award, a brief appearance, a photograph that could keep scholarships alive. Julian promised himself a simple plan. Stand near a column, accept the medal, leave before anyone decided he was interesting. The palace hall felt less like a room and more like a machine built to turn people into narratives. Chandeliers poured light with no warmth. Cameras sat on tripods like silent guards, lenses fixed and patient. Journalists waited at the edges, pretending to mingle while scanning for fractures. Security moved in patterns that looked casual, until Julian noticed the earpieces, the synchronized pauses, the doors that stayed closed with the calm certainty of command. He kept his shoulders loose and his breath measured. His suppressants sat heavy in his bloodstream, pushing his scent down, making him safer to be near. Still, his body reacted as if danger lived in the marble. He accepted the medal with steady hands, offered a polite smile for the flash, and immediately angled toward the nearest exit. That was when the room changed, not with noise at first, but with motion. Heads turned in the same direction. Postures tightened. A small knot of guards shifted toward the far entrance. Someone murmured into an earpiece, urgent and low. The orchestra kept playing, but the music suddenly sounded distant, like it was coming from another building. Then a child broke free of the adults. The boy moved fast across the polished floor, too small for the formal suit he wore, too determined to be wandering by accident. Hands reached for him and missed. A guard stepped into his path and hesitated for half a second, as if the rulebook had no page for this. The child slipped through and kept running. Julian's instincts flared before reason did. He started to step back, already bracing for collision, when the boy reached him as if the hall did not exist. Small hands grabbed Julian's coat with both fists. A face buried into Julian's stomach with a force that stole his breath. The child held on like he had been falling for a long time and had finally found the one thing that did not move. Julian's arms went around him automatically, steadying his weight. The boy's shoulders shook, not with fear, Julian realized, but with relief so sharp it looked like pain. No, Julian breathed, barely more than air. Please! The cameras found them instantly. Flashes popped like cold sparks. Shutters clicked in a hungry rhythm. Julian lifted his head and saw the nearest security officer's expression, and cold went straight through his ribs. It was not confusion. It was recognition. The guard's hand hovered at his earpiece, frozen between duty and disbelief. The child looked up. His eyes were bright, wet, furious with the world, and devoted to Julian all at once. Then he turned his face toward the hall, toward the lights and the lenses, and his small voice cut cleanly through the murmurs. Father. The word fell into the room like a dropped glass. Conversation snapped off mid-syllable. The orchestra faltered. For a heartbeat, even the cameras seemed to pause, as if the country itself needed a second to decide what it had just heard. Julian's pulse slammed against his throat. Father was not a title he had earned. It was not a story he had invented. It was a word no one had ever given him the right to wear. He tightened his hold on the child without meaning to, as if letting go would erase the sound of that single syllable. His gaze snagged across the hall, drawn by a presence he had learned to notice without understanding. Adrian Voss stood among the academy delegation, tall and perfectly still, too composed to be a normal student at an awards night. His face held no surprise. His eyes held something older than anger and sharper than fear, like a decision being made at the edge of a blade. Around him, palace staff shifted unconsciously, making room, instinctively deferring. Someone whispered, trembling, "Your Highness?" And the whisper spread like heat through dry paper. Julian's stomach dropped. He looked down at the child again and saw the way he clung, fingers curled into fabric like a lifeline. This was not a staged moment. This was not a misunderstanding that would soften with explanation. This was a story that would be owned, edited, weaponized, and sold in 1,000 versions before the night ended, and it had just chosen Julian Hart as its headline. 2 weeks earlier, Julian's life had been small on purpose. He taught ethics and literature at St. Aurelian Academy, a school that looked gentle in brochures and felt sharp in real life. The marketing photos showed ivy, gold afternoon light, boys in perfect uniforms laughing like their futures were guaranteed. The corridors Julian walked every day smelled of ink, polished wood, expensive cologne, and quiet pressure. The kind of pressure that never raised its voice because it never needed to. The sons of diplomats and heirs learned early how to smile while measuring each other, how to speak as if every sentence might be quoted later. Julian moved through that world like a person trained to leave no fingerprints. He arrived early before the hallways filled. He kept his classroom neat, his desk clear, his lesson plans printed and filed. He loved books in the way people loved lifeboats. He taught stories about power and choice to boys who would someday inherit both, and he did it with a calm voice that never offered too much of himself. Outside the academy, his apartment was plain and quiet. It sat on the edge of the city in a building that never got repaired quickly. The elevator sometimes stalled between floors. The hallway lights flickered when it rained. His neighbors didn't ask questions, and Julian returned the favor. He kept his keys in the same pocket, his shoes lined up by the door, his phone always charged. He lived like someone who had once lost control and refused to lose it again. He kept his omega status muted with suppressants, not because he was ashamed, but because he had learned what people did to labels. Omega Teacher became a rumor in someone's mouth before it became a fact on paper. It became a target, a joke, a fantasy, a challenge. Julian had seen it happen to others, watched competent colleagues get reduced to scent and stereotype, watched boundaries tested under the guise of admiration. He had decided he would be boring on purpose, invisible where it mattered, safe. His boundaries were a quiet religion. He never stayed alone with a student behind a locked door. He kept meetings in classrooms with windows, in offices with open blinds. He documented every unusual incident, every prolonged complaint, every moment that felt slightly wrong. If a student lingered after class, Julian made sure another staff member was within sight. If a parent cornered him in the hallway, Julian steered the conversation into places where witnesses existed. He spoke calmly, smiled politely, and gave nothing away. Survival, for him, had always been about controlling angles. Adrian Voss had appeared in his class like an elegant problem. On paper, the boy was everything the academy celebrated. An alpha in his final year, top of every ranking, flawless attendance, immaculate conduct. He never joined gossip. He never failed an exam. He always wore his uniform as if it had been tailored to his bones. He was polite without warmth, respectful without softness, and somehow older than the other boys even when he sat still. Julian had noticed him from the first week, not because he was loud, but because he was quiet in a different way. Adrian did not relax when other students relaxed. He did not laugh when they laughed. He watched the room like he was mapping it. When Julian spoke, Adrian listened with the attention of someone reading for weaknesses, not learning for grades. It was unsettling, not threatening exactly, just too focused. There were oddities around him that Julian could not ignore. Adrian's schedule was guarded like a government file. His absences were approved instantly with no explanation, sometimes mid-class. A simple message to the headmaster, and then Adrian would stand, collect his things, and leave without a word. Unknown staff members appeared in corridors on certain days, not teachers, not parents, too alert to be normal visitors. They stood by the stairwells as if measuring distances. They watched doors as if expecting them to open the wrong way. Once, Julian passed one of them and felt the faint click of an earpiece adjustment. Wealthy family paranoia, Julian told himself. Old money security, nothing that belonged to him. Still, his body never fully agreed. The longer Adrian was in his class, the more Julian felt watched in ways that had nothing to do with school. Not stalked, not hunted. Assessed. One afternoon, Julian left campus later than usual and noticed a black car idling across the street with its lights off. It could have belonged to anyone. The city was full of black cars. But his skin prickled anyway, the same instinct that had once kept him alive. He walked faster, keys already between his fingers, and when he glanced back, the car was gone. At home, he took his suppressants and tried to breathe through the familiar ache that came with forcing his own biology into silence. He stared at the ceiling until the tension drained from his muscles in slow, reluctant waves. Quiet was not comfort for Julian. Quiet was work. What he did not allow himself to remember was the year he had sealed behind a locked door in his mind. The year that did not fit into his careful routines. He remembered flashes only when he was exhausted, harsh white clinic lights, disinfectant that burned his nose, bruises on his ribs he could not explain. He remembered waking with a blank stretch of time where memories should have been, and a confidentiality form on the bedside table with his signature at the bottom. He remembered thinking, in a voice that sounded like a stranger's, "I did not sign this." He remembered the fear that followed like a shadow for months. He had survived by shrinking his life until it became manageable. 2 weeks earlier, Julian had believed that would be enough. He had believed that if he stayed careful, if he stayed quiet, the world would eventually forget he existed. He did not know his careful, quiet life had already been noticed from above by someone who measured rooms the way soldiers did. He did not know his name was already sitting in a file, tied to a prince's childhood and a storm night no one wanted reopened, and he did not know that the palace was about to pull him out of the shadows, whether he wanted it or not. Adrian Voss never flirted. In a school full of alphas who treated charm like currency, Adrian moved as if charm was beneath him. He did not smile too long. He did not lean in close. He did not test boundaries for sport. He kept his distance with a precision that felt deliberate, almost rehearsed, as if proximity itself could become a weapon if handled wrong. Julian noticed him first through paper. Adrian's handwriting was clean, controlled, almost surgical, each letter shaped with the same disciplined pressure. His essays were not the work of a teenager trying to impress a teacher. They read like reports written by someone who had learned early that words could ruin lives. When the class discussed power, Adrian did not romanticize it. He wrote about it as if it had weight, as if it left marks on the hands that held it too long. Julian told himself it was nothing. Private academies produced many kinds of gifted students. Some were lonely. Some were raised with expectations that turned childhood into performance. Some had been trained too early to be normal. Still, Adrian's attention felt different. It was not hungry, not romantic, not predatory, protective. Julian saw it in small things at first, the kind of details most people missed because they were too quiet to look like drama. A cluster of loud alphas in the corridor once drifted too close to Julian's shoulder, laughing in that careless way that suggested they believed the space around an omega belonged to them. Before Julian even spoke, Adrian stepped sideways, not aggressively, not confrontational, just enough to shift the geometry of the hallway so the group had to widen their path and stop crowding. The boys didn't even realize why they changed direction. They only felt, instinctively, that something had corrected them. Another time, during a debate, a student's joke crossed the line into something ugly. Julian prepared to shut it down with measured authority, but Adrian's voice cut in first, low and calm, like a blade sliding into a sheath. The joke died instantly. The room reset itself. No raised voices, no spectacle, just correction. Julian should have been grateful. He was not, because protection, when unasked for, felt like intimacy. And intimacy was something Julian had learned to treat like fire. It warmed you until it burned you. The strangest part was Adrian's sense of time. Julian did not broadcast his schedule. He left campus at different hours depending on meetings, grading, staff briefings. Yet Adrian always seemed to be nearby when Julian crossed the courtyard toward the gates, not following, not hovering, simply existing in the same space as if that was coincidence. Sometimes Adrian stood by the old stone fountain, eyes on his phone, but his posture told Julian he was listening to everything. Sometimes he was already in a car at the curb, the dark-tinted windows making it impossible to see who sat inside with him. Julian began to feel observed in a way that had nothing to do with school performance, not hunted, not stalked, something colder and more professional than that, like security. He disliked it, and he disliked himself for noticing it. He tried to keep the relationship clean, teacher and student, nothing more. He gave feedback in writing, kept meetings brief, never praised Adrian too personally. Yet Adrian watched him anyway, not with softness, but with the steady focus of someone reading a locked door, learning where it might open. One afternoon, the headmaster summoned Julian to the office. The room smelled of leather furniture and old money. A framed photo of donors sat on the shelf, all smiles and handshakes. The headmaster spoke politely about honor and responsibility, about how the palace was sponsoring scholarships, how a royal reception would strengthen public trust, how the academy needed presentable staff to attend. Julian felt the cold knot form in his stomach before he understood why. It was the same knot his body produced before storms, before sudden violence, before nights that ended with paperwork he didn't remember signing. He tried to refuse. He gave practical reasons. He mentioned workload, personal privacy, the risk of unwanted attention. The headmaster's smile didn't change, but the air tightened. The refusal was not accepted. The invitation was not an invitation. Julian left the office with his hands steady and his chest hollow. As he crossed the courtyard that evening, the sky hung low and gray, the kind of gray that made everything feel sharper. The students moved in clusters, laughing, tossing comments at one another. Adrian stood apart from them, near the shadow of a column, watching the courtyard as if the space belonged to him. When Julian passed, Adrian's gaze lifted and held him. There was no warning in it. No threat, only the look of someone who already knew what was coming and had been preparing for it in silence. Julian's throat tightened. He wanted to say, "What are you doing?" He wanted to say, "Stay away from me." He wanted to say, "I do not need you." Instead, only a small sound escaped him, barely a whisper. "Stop." Adrian did not move. He did not nod. He did not acknowledge the word, but something in his posture shifted, as if he had taken the instruction and filed it somewhere deep, beside other orders he could not ignore. Julian went home and checked the locks he never believed in. He refilled his suppressants, counting the pills twice, then 3 times, because anxiety made numbers slippery. He washed his hands until his skin stung. He told himself he was overreacting, that the palace reception was only a night, that the academy's world could not reach into his small apartment. His body disagreed. In bed, with the lights off, he felt the old memory press against the back of his mind like a bruise. White light, disinfectant, a pen in his fingers, a signature that didn't feel like his own, a child's weight, fleeting and real, and then the sensation of being told to forget. Julian lay still and listened to the city breathe outside his window. His heart beat too fast for sleep. He had built his life around quiet, and now quiet felt like the pause before something opened. Julian's suppressed memory had edges. It did not arrive as a neat story. It came in fragments that scraped at him in sleep, in the thin moment between waking and breathing, when the mind was still too soft to hold a lock. A wet street, the metallic taste of panic, a siren far away, not coming closer, just existing as a reminder that help was never truly meant for him. A child's hand slipping in his own, small fingers cold and stubborn. Julian would wake with his heart racing and the phantom weight of a small body pressed against his chest, as if his muscles refused to accept that the child was not there. The day before the reception, the dream returned sharper than ever, like a file reopened without permission. Years ago, before St. Aurelian, before the routines and the paperwork and the careful quiet, Julian had worked part-time at a community center near the old theater district. It had been a temporary job in his mind, a way to pay rent while he finished certifications. The building was warm, scuffed, full of children from families who did not have money for private tutors. Julian had liked it because it was honest. Nobody wore masks well there. Everyone was too tired. That night had started with rain that felt personal. The sky had poured as if it had been holding something back for years. The streets filled fast, water slapping against curbs and turning alleys into narrow rivers. Julian had stayed late, cleaning up after a youth program. He remembered shutting off lights, hearing the building settle, and stepping into the storm with his coat pulled tight, thinking only of getting home. He had heard the sound near the theater service gate by accident. Not a cry, not a call, a small, broken inhale. The gate was metal, tall, locked with a chain. Behind it, the alley was darker than it should have been, rain turning the pavement into a mirror. Julian saw a shape crouched near the wall, too still to be a stray animal, too small to be an adult. For a second, his brain refused to assign it meaning. Then, the child lifted his head. The boy was soaked through, shivering in a way that looked wrong for someone dressed that well. The coat he wore was too expensive for the alley, the fabric heavy and dark, clinging to him like it had been dragged through the rain for hours. His shoes were polished but scuffed at the toes, as if he had run until his feet hurt. His hair was plastered to his forehead, and his face was pale, not from cold alone, but from exhaustion that reached deeper than weather. Most children would have cried. Most children would have asked for help. This child only stared at Julian, eyes wide and silent, as if he had learned that noise invited the wrong kind of attention. Julian's throat tightened. He crouched slowly, careful, keeping his hands visible, his voice low. "Hey, it's okay. You're okay." The boy flinched anyway, then moved before Julian could finish breathing. He stepped forward and grabbed Julian's coat with both hands, not timidly, not politely. With the desperate certainty of someone who had already decided the world was unsafe and had found one brief exception, Julian felt the child press into him, shaking hard enough that his own ribs vibrated. The smell of rain and stone filled Julian's nose, and beneath it, something faint and expensive, like a scent meant for palace rooms, not alleyways. Julian swallowed the rising panic and did the only thing that made sense. He lifted the boy. The child was lighter than he should have been, all bones and tension, clinging around Julian's neck like he was afraid Julian might dissolve. Julian carried him back to the community center because it was the nearest place with warmth and light. He wrapped him in a blanket from the supply closet, set him on a chair near a space heater, and tried to get a name. The boy gave him nothing at first, just breath, shallow and fast, and eyes that tracked every doorway. Julian offered water. The child drank like he had been taught not to spill. Julian offered a phone. The child stared at it as if it might bite. Julian called emergency services anyway, because it was what a responsible adult was supposed to do. He tried to describe the situation without sounding like a liar. A child, alone, behind a locked theater gate, dressed like money, terrified and silent. The police arrived fast, too fast. Julian remembered noticing that detail even then, before his mind learned to erase it. The patrol car pulled up within minutes, rain still hammering the roof, lights cutting through the street like a signal. 2 officers entered, but they did not look surprised. They did not ask the usual questions first. They looked around the room as if checking corners, then looked at the boy with a kind of practiced relief. And behind them came men who did not introduce themselves. They wore plain coats and carried authority like weapons. No badges, no names. But their presence changed the air. The officers stepped slightly aside when they entered, instinctively yielding space. One of the men spoke a few quiet words to the child, and the boy's grip on Julian tightened like a reflex. Julian's chest went tight. "He's scared," Julian said before he could stop himself. "He needs—" One of the men turned his eyes on Julian, and Julian felt the sudden understanding of hierarchy, not the academy kind, the kind that could rewrite reality. "He will be safe now," the man said, calm and final. Julian tried to hold his ground, but the boy's face lifted toward him in a moment that broke Julian's defenses. The child's lips moved, barely forming sound. "Don't." That single word landed like a bruise. Julian's hands shook as he smoothed the blanket around the boy's shoulders. "I'm right here," he whispered, even though he could already feel the moment slipping away from him. The men took the child gently, efficiently, as if they had done it many times. The boy reached for Julian once, fingers stretching, then disappearing into the fold of the man's coat. Julian stood there in the harsh fluorescent light of the center, wet and helpless, watching the door close on something he could not name. The next morning, Julian was called into a small office he did not remember entering. There were forms on the table. There was coffee he did not recall accepting. There was a pen placed in his hand, with the quiet certainty of someone who expected compliance. The paperwork was written in clean, formal language that blurred when Julian tried to focus. confidentiality, non-disclosure, cooperation, protection. He signed because he felt like refusing would open a hole beneath his life. He was thanked. He was told he had done the right thing. He was instructed, politely, to forget. His phone was replaced with a newer model, already activated. His personal records were corrected, a phrase that sounded harmless until he realized it meant parts of his life could be edited without his consent. He was told the child would be safe. After that, the year became fog. Julian changed jobs, changed neighborhoods, changed his name in one bureaucratic letter that felt suspiciously easy, as if someone had greased every gear ahead of him. He told himself it was trauma, a random crisis, a random child, a random night. He never connected it to royalty because he had no right to imagine his life brushing against that world. And yet, the night before the reception, Julian stood in his bathroom and stared at his own reflection until his eyes watered. He realized he remembered one detail with absolute certainty. In the community center, under the blanket, the child had looked at him with a fierce, shaking devotion and called him a word that meant protector, not officially, not legally, but with the full weight of a child deciding who his world belonged to. After the reception, Julian was escorted out of the hall not by academy staff, but by palace security. It happened with the smooth speed of something rehearsed. A hand appeared near his elbow without touching, guiding him as if the marble itself had rules he did not know. Another guard stepped into the line of cameras, turning his body into a polite wall. An aide smiled at the journalists and redirected them toward a different cluster of guests, voice bright and harmless as if nothing unusual had occurred. But the room had already changed. The air carried that metallic taste of a scandal being born. Julian's mind kept replaying the boy's grip on his coat, the weight of a small body pressed against him, the word that had cracked the hall open. The child had not sounded playful. He had sounded relieved, like someone who had finally reached shore. "Father," Julian swallowed hard as he was guided through a side door. He expected someone from the academy to appear, to explain, to laugh it off as a misunderstanding. No one did. The academy delegation stayed where it was, still smiling for donors, still pretending their teacher had not just become national content. Behind the scenes, the palace moved like a system protecting its heart. They took him through corridors that smelled of cold stone, expensive polish, and something faintly medicinal. The carpet muted footsteps. The lighting was soft enough to be kind, bright enough to expose. Every few meters, another guard stood perfectly still, eyes forward, hands clasped. Julian noticed the earpieces, the coded glances, the subtle way doors opened before they were touched. Somewhere behind them, the clip escaped anyway. Julian could almost feel it happening. A phone recording in a pocket, a camera feed copied before the cut, a single frame sent to the wrong contact. Once a story became profitable, it stopped being controllable. The palace could shut doors. It could not shut hunger. Julian's suppressants pressed heavy in his bloodstream. He had taken them that morning to stay neutral, to stay safe. Now the stress pried at his biology like a crowbar. His pulse ran too fast, his palms dampened, his scent threatened to rise, not seductive, just human and frightened. They placed him in a private room with a single couch, a low table, and a discreet camera in the corner. The windows were covered, the silence was padded. It felt less like hospitality and more like containment dressed in velvet. An official entered, not in a uniform, but in a suit that carried authority the way a blade carried shine. Behind him stood a physician with a tablet and a security chief whose eyes never stopped measuring Julian's hands. The official spoke with careful calm, as if words themselves could prevent panic. The child, he said, was Prince Leon. Julian's breath caught. The name landed in his chest like a thrown stone. The boy who had clung to him under the chandeliers, the boy whose small fists had trembled with relief, was the youngest of the royal line. Julian felt his mouth go dry. His mind tried to deny it on instinct. Royalty belonged to screens and ceremonies, not to his hands, not to his coat, not to the word father echoing in a room full of cameras. Then the official added the second name as if it were merely administrative. The older Alpha student Julian had taught for months under a false surname was Crown Prince Adrian Vale. For a moment, Julian heard nothing after that. The room blurred at the edges. He thought of the student called Adrian Voss, the controlled posture, the absence approvals that arrived instantly, the unfamiliar men in corridors, the black car at the curb. It had all been true, and none of it had been his business until now. It should have felt like a twist from a film. Instead, it felt like a trap door opening under his careful life. Because the narrative wrote itself faster than any defense could. An Omega teacher, a crown prince, a child prince calling him father, cameras, conspiracy theories, court factions, tabloid hunger, accusations that could destroy careers and bodies. Julian wasn't asked what he wanted. He was informed what was happening. An internal inquiry would be launched to ensure the welfare of the princes. Julian would remain on palace grounds temporarily for safety. He would not contact media. He would not leave without security clearance. He would submit to medical checks because stress could trigger Omega instability, and the palace did not tolerate unknown variables. Julian heard it all as if underwater. Every sentence sounded reasonable. Every sentence sounded like a cage. "I didn't do anything," he said, and hated how small it sounded. The physician's eyes softened for a fraction of a second, then returned to professional neutrality. The security chief studied Julian as if looking for a crack where danger could enter. Julian's thoughts splintered. The storm night memory burned at the back of his skull. The child in the rain, the men who carried authority like weapons, the papers he had signed, the year that became fog. He had spent so long shrinking his life to avoid this kind of attention, and now attention had found him anyway, wearing a crown. The door opened behind the official. Julian looked up and saw Adrian. Not Adrian Voss, not a student in uniform. The crown prince stood in a tailored suit, posture immaculate, expression controlled in a way that looked like discipline and felt like restraint, held at the edge of breaking. The guards in the corridor shifted subtly, making room, instinctively lowering the temperature of the space around him. Adrian's gaze met Julian's. There was no surprise in it, no confusion, only something sharp and old, as if he had been waiting for this moment and had already decided what he would do with it. Julian's throat tightened. "This isn't real," he whispered, and heard the tremor in his own voice. Adrian didn't step closer, but the room seemed to tilt toward him anyway. His voice, when it came, was low and steady, a single line that cut through the noise in Julian's head. "It is real." And Julian understood with a sick clarity that the prince had been watching him for months, not because he was curious, but because he had been waiting for his brother to recognize him, and because he had been deciding in silence what he would do when the inevitable finally happened. The palace's version of kindness arrived in paperwork. Julian was moved before sunrise when the corridors were quiet and the press outside the gates still hunted for coffee and a better angle. A car with tinted windows carried him through an internal entrance, away from the parts of the palace tourists saw on postcards. He expected something cold and punitive. What he received was something worse. Comfort with restraint sewn into the seams. The temporary residence wing felt like a hotel built inside a fortress. The carpet muffled every step. The lighting was soft enough to make faces look calm. A fruit bowl sat on a polished table as if hunger could be solved with aesthetics. Julian's room had a view of an inner courtyard he could not access, the kind of view designed to suggest freedom while proving its absence. He was assigned a liaison whose smile never faltered, a physician who spoke in careful, clinical phrases, and security that shadowed him without sounding like footsteps. The guards were always there, and never intrusive in a way anyone could accuse. They stood at the end of hallways. They opened doors a beat too early. They appeared outside his room whenever he left. The palace called it protection. Julian felt it as surveillance wearing gloves. They told him it was necessary. Threats were already blooming online. Accusations, doxing attempts, anonymous messages that smelled like obsession and violence. People who hated the monarchy wanted a scandal. People who worshipped the monarchy wanted a sacrifice. And in the middle stood an Omega teacher, with a face now circulating through clipped videos and slowed-down frames. Julian tried not to look at the screens, but the liaison brought a printed summary anyway, as if paper made cruelty more polite. Words like predator and infiltrator appeared beside his name. Someone had posted his former address. Someone else had dug up a photograph from years ago and labeled it proof of corruption. The palace's voice stayed calm as it explained the situation, but Julian heard the subtext clearly. You are a risk we must manage. The internal inquiry began immediately. Julian sat in a sterile office with a long table and a small recorder that blinked like a patient eye. He gave his employment history, his credentials, background checks, references, every lesson plan he had ever submitted, every incident report, every email he had sent to parents, every note he had made when a student crossed a boundary, even slightly. He had always documented his life like someone building armor against misunderstanding. Now those documents became his only proof that he had been careful on purpose. The most painful part was how reasonable the questions were. The palace did not need to shout to hurt. It only needed to imply. It only needed to frame suspicion as duty. Why had he chosen that academy? Why had he taught that student? Why had he attended the reception at all? Why did the child call him father? Julian answered with a steady voice while his ribs felt too tight for air. He explained protocols, he explained ethics, he explained boundaries. He explained the obvious. A child's word did not equal an adult's crime. Still, he watched the expressions across the table remain neutral in the way people stayed neutral when they did not want to admit they already believed something. An omega near royal heirs, the heir seemed to say, was inherently suspicious. Julian's hands shook once, just once, and he clenched them under the table until his nails bit skin. I did not touch him, he said quietly. I did not groom anyone. I taught. No one argued. No one reassured him. They simply took notes. When the session ended, the liaison escorted him back through corridors where paintings watched without mercy. Julian realized the palace did not have to convict him to ruin him. It only had to keep him in a state of permanent explanation until the public decided he was guilty from exhaustion alone. That was when Julian insisted on the one line he could still draw. He would not remain Adrian's teacher. The ethical boundary was not negotiable. Even if Adrian was technically of age, even if graduation was close enough to blur the power dynamic on paper. The palace would use any proximity as ammunition. Julian refused to be an excuse for scandal. He refused to be positioned as a temptation, a weakness, a narrative. I'm done, he said, and surprised himself with the firmness of it. I will not teach him again. The palace officials accepted the statement with a nod that felt like agreement and also like dismissal. It did not matter what Julian refused. The palace would still decide where he stood. The academy made its decision within 48 hours. It arrived as a polite email, forwarded by the liaison, phrased in soft language that hit a blade. Temporary leave, administrative caution, protection of institutional reputation. Julian read it twice before his vision blurred. It was a clean cut, the kind institutions made to keep donors comfortable and scandals far from ivy walls. Julian felt the ground disappear. He had built his life around rules, and the rules had still failed him. He had stayed careful, stayed documented, stayed quiet. It had not saved him. It had only made him easier to remove without noise. In the middle of this collapse, Prince Leon kept asking for him, not in speeches, not in public. In the relentless, ordinary way children demanded stability. A hand reaching for a sleeve, a body refusing to sleep unless the right person was near. A voice going small and raw when doors closed. Palace physicians began to track the pattern. The child calmed only when Julian was in the room. Sleep improved. Night terrors reduced. Appetite returned. Vital signs stabilized faster. The observations were written in neat medical language, but Julian felt the truth beneath it like a bruise. Leon had chosen him as safe. The palace responded with brutal logic. If the child's well-being depended on Julian's presence, then Julian would be kept close, not his family, not his father. Not as anything that could imply rights or permanence. He would be kept as a controlled asset labeled necessary, a stabilizing figure with restrictions, a solution to a problem that could not be allowed to become emotional in the eyes of the court. The liaison brought another folder. Inside was a contract with careful phrases, residency terms, confidentiality requirements, movement limitations, medical compliance, media silence. There were clauses about appropriate contact and approved supervision. There were paragraphs that described his life as a variable to be controlled. Julian stared at the pages until the words swam. Protection, he realized, was just another kind of cage, and cages had always been where Omega Lives got managed. He signed anyway, because Leon's safety sat heavier on his conscience than his own pride, and because he understood something terrifyingly simple. In the palace, kindness was never free. It was only a softer way of holding someone. Julian's role shifted without ceremony. There was no announcement, no formal title spoken aloud in a grand room. The palace simply rewired his days and expected his body to follow. He stopped being a teacher with a classroom and a schedule. He became a stability figure, a phrase so clinical it could have been pulled from a medical chart, stamped with polite authority, and filed beside dosage adjustments and risk assessments. The contract had already trained everyone around him. Staff spoke to Julian with softened voices and careful distance. They did not call him family. They did not call him father. They used neutral words that left no fingerprints on the future. Companion, support, authorized presence, necessary contact. Leon did not care about any of it. The boy was not told what words to use. He used them anyway, with the blunt honesty of a child who believed naming something made it real. He followed Julian through rooms like a magnet, small footsteps always just behind, always in range. If Julian sat, Leon leaned into him. If Julian stood, Leon reached for a sleeve. If Julian turned his head, Leon's eyes tracked him as if losing sight meant losing oxygen. During medical consultations, Leon fell asleep against Julian's side with his fingers curled around fabric, refusing to be separated even by a clipboard. When strangers entered, especially men with official posture and controlled sense, Leon's shoulders tightened. His gaze darted toward exits. His breath became shallow. But when Julian's hand rested lightly on his back, the tension eased as if someone had turned down a volume inside him. Julian saw the pattern and hated how helpless it made him feel. He tried to keep it simple. Routine, meals, quiet reading, small, predictable rituals that told a child's nervous system the world would behave. Breakfast at the same hour. A warm drink held carefully in small hands. A story read in the same chair. A short walk in the secure gardens where the sky was visible, but freedom was not. The gardens were beautiful in the way cages could be beautiful. Trimmed hedges, pale stone paths, trees arranged like art. The air smelled clean, filtered by money. Leon ran ahead sometimes, then always looked back to confirm Julian was still there. His joy never fully detached from vigilance. Julian learned to move slower, to breathe softer, to anchor himself even when his own chest felt tight with stress. He had spent years training himself to be quiet for survival. Now, quiet became a tool for someone else's survival, and that changed its weight. The palace physicians noticed. They tracked Leon's sleep and appetite, his panic spikes, his regression patterns. The data lined up with what Julian already knew without charts. Leon was calm when Julian was near. Leon unraveled when Julian was removed. The palace called it attachment. Julian called it a child remembering safety. Then, Julian began to notice Adrian. The crown prince did not storm into Leon's space. He did not demand affection. He did not insist on his rights as an older brother or heir. He acted with restraint so precise it looked like self-control carved into muscle. Adrian appeared in the margins. He sat at the far end of a room, reading reports, posture perfect, eyes always scanning. He remained quiet while Leon played near Julian's feet with blocks and small carved animals, allowing the child to notice him without pressure. Sometimes Adrian's scent drifted lightly across the space, restrained and clean, never pushed forward like a claim. Julian had met many alphas who treated a room as theirs by scent alone. Adrian treated it like a battlefield where unnecessary force created casualties. Leon responded in stages. At first, he ignored Adrian completely, as if the older alpha was part of the furniture. Then he started glancing toward him, checking for movement. Then, one afternoon, Leon rolled a small wooden animal across the carpet in Adrian's direction, not an offering, not a greeting, more like a test. Adrian did not smile. He did not rush. He simply reached out, picked up the small figure, and placed it back on the carpet with gentle care. No words, no performance. Just a quiet acknowledgement. Leon watched closely. then crawled back to Julian and pressed his forehead against Julian's knee as if needing reassurance that the world had not shifted beneath him. Julian's hand smoothed Leon's hair automatically, and he felt something tighten in his throat. Julian began to see what Adrian had always been, disciplined to the point of loneliness, raised inside expectations so heavy they reshaped the spine, trained to offer stability without asking for affection in return, because affection in royal life was often transactional. Julian had once mistaken Adrian's distance for coldness. Now he recognized it as control sharpened into survival. The palace was full of people who served Adrian, tutors, advisors, guards, staff who bowed their heads and never met his eyes for too long. But service was not closeness. Service was not warmth. Julian saw how Adrian moved through his own home like a man surrounded and still alone. Julian, despite fear and resentment, found himself doing what he had always done with students, observing, adapting, protecting boundaries. He adjusted Leon's routines so Adrian could be present without becoming a threat. He arranged quiet afternoons where Leon could see his brother from a safe distance. He asked staff, politely but firmly, not to crowd the child when Adrian entered, because too many adults in one space made Leon's body treat the moment as danger. Sometimes Julian caught himself thinking like a strategist. He hated that. He hated how quickly palace life turned compassion into logistics, yet he could not deny the result. Leon's panic softened, his sleep stretched longer, his small laughter returned in short bursts, like sunlight breaking through clouds. One evening, after Leon had finally fallen asleep on a couch with his cheek pressed to Julian's side, Adrian stood near the doorway, watching them. The room was dim, the air quiet except for Leon's slow breathing. Julian lifted his eyes and found Adrian's gaze fixed on him. It was not the public stare of a prince. It was not the cool evaluation of an institution. It was human, tired, controlled, grateful in a way that hurt to see because it was unspoken. Julian's chest tightened as something dangerous bloomed inside him. Not romance, not yet recognition. The feeling of being seen by an alpha who did not treat Omega closeness as entitlement, who did not treat Julian as a scandal or a convenience, but as a person holding the center of his brother's healing. Julian's lips parted before he could stop himself, and a small, raw sentence slipped out, barely more than a whisper. He's trying. Adrian's eyes flickered, like the words landed deeper than they should have. His voice, when it came, was low and controlled, but something in it cracked at the edges. I know. Julian looked back down at Leon, at the child's hand still gripping his sleeve even in sleep, and felt the first fracture in his armor widen. Because bonds did not care about contracts, and the palace, no matter how carefully it named things, could not fully control what a child's heart decided to build. The media did not care about nuance. It fed on shapes, not truth. It fed on a child's small hands clutching an Omega teacher's coat, and the single word that turned a reception into a national wound. The clip was barely 10 seconds long, but it repeated across screens until it became more familiar than Julian's own face in the mirror. It played in slowed frames, in zoomed crops, in sound bites stacked with dramatic music. Every replay shaved off context and added appetite. Within hours, strangers had decided who Julian was. They called him a manipulator, an Omega who had trained a prince to say the right word at the right time. They called him a plant, placed by anti-monarchists to humiliate the royal family on camera. They called him a lover, an illicit secret tucked behind palace walls and disguised as a teacher. They called him a gold digger aiming for titles. Conspiracy forums built entire genealogies out of lighting angles and the position of Julian's hands, inventing hidden heirs and erased births, stitching fantasy into something that looked almost like evidence if you stared too long. Julian watched none of it by choice. The palace tried to control his exposure, but the world leaked in anyway. A staff member's phone buzzed with headlines. A television in a corridor played a panel discussion too loud to ignore. A newspaper left on a chair showed his face beside the word scandal in thick black letters. The rumor machine moved faster than any investigation, and it moved with more confidence than facts. The palace's public response was careful, cold, and incomplete. They released a statement crafted to be technically true and emotionally empty. They denied nothing explicitly. They confirmed nothing either. They spoke of an unexpected incident involving a minor member of the royal family, and ongoing internal review. They asked for privacy. They promised responsibility. They offered no story the public could accept, and the public filled the silence with teeth. The palace assumed the narrative would starve without fuel. Instead, it grew hungry. Inside the court, factions formed like storms. Traditionalists saw Julian as contamination, a breach of lineage and discipline, proof that outside influence had entered sacred space. Reformists saw him as a symbol, an inconvenient mirror held up to a monarchy that claimed benevolence while treating people like assets. Opportunists saw him as a weapon against Adrian's succession, a lever to pull when they wanted the crown prince weakened or controlled. Every dinner table became a battlefield. Every meeting became a chessboard. Every hallway glance carried calculations that Julian could feel even when no one spoke. He learned the court did not need to shout. It only needed to watch you as if you were already guilty. Julian felt the pressure in his body first. Suppressants fought the palace air, and the palace air fought back. Stress pushed his pheromones toward the surface in a way that made him feel exposed, as if his skin had become transparent. Nausea returned in bitter waves. His sleep fractured into thin segments, and when he woke, his sheets were cold with sweat. Palace doctors adjusted his regimen and monitored him like a machine that could malfunction at any moment. They spoke gently while noting his vital signs, as if calm voices could prevent biology from betraying him. They were not cruel. That was what made it worse. Their professionalism carried the same implication as everything else. Be manageable. Be stable. Be quiet. Julian tried. He stayed in his assigned wing. He followed protocols. He kept his movements predictable. He focused on Leon's routines, because Leon's routines were the only honest thing in that building. Breakfast, reading, walks, naps, the same chair, the same blanket. Leon did not care about court politics. Leon cared about safety, and safety had Julian's scent and Julian's hands. Then, the threats stopped being digital. It happened on an ordinary evening, when Julian returned from a consultation and found the corridor unusually empty. The guard stood farther down than usual. The light seemed dimmer, though he could not prove it. His door looked untouched. Inside, nothing was missing, nothing was broken. The note waited on the floor like a small white animal. No signature, no fingerprints, no obvious source. Just a single sheet slid under the door with neat aristocratic handwriting that carried cruelty like perfume. It implied Leon would be returned to proper blood soon, as if a child were an heirloom that had been misplaced and would be reclaimed. The wording was polite enough to be deniable and violent enough to make Julian's stomach drop. Julian's hands went cold. His mouth tasted like metal. He did not scream. He did not run. He simply stood there, staring at the paper until his vision narrowed. One sentence beat through his skull louder than any headline. They will take him. He called security with a voice that sounded steady and distant. When the guards arrived, their faces did not show shock, only confirmation, as if the palace had been waiting for the rumors to grow sharp enough to cut. Security tightened immediately. Leon was moved to a more restricted wing. Julian was told it was for safety, as if the word could soften separation into something acceptable. They promised he would still see Leon, just with scheduled access and approved supervision. They promised the child would adjust. Leon did not adjust. The first night without Julian's constant presence shattered the small progress they had built. Leon's sleep broke into panic. He woke crying hard enough to shake. He refused food. His small body braced at every unfamiliar sound. When Julian was allowed in the next day, Leon launched himself toward him with desperate force, fingers clutching fabric as if proving Julian was real. Julian held him and felt the truth the palace refused to say out loud. Leon's bond was not sentimental. It was neurological, built out of trauma and memory. The child did not want Julian for comfort alone. The child needed Julian the way a person needed air after drowning. The physicians noticed. They recorded it. Their notes became harder to ignore. Still, the court did not soften. The rumor machine did not pause. If anything, Leon's distress became more material to be twisted. Commentators called it proof of manipulation. Traditionalists called it weakness. Opportunists called it leverage. Julian felt himself slipping into exhaustion. His body wanted to shut down. His mind kept cycling the same fear. If they could separate him from Leon once, they could do it again, and next time the door might not reopen. Adrian responded with a decision that altered everything. He did not call a meeting. He did not negotiate with factions. He did not wait for permission that would be delayed by politics. He removed Julian and Leon from the palace for 48 hours and moved them to a secure countryside estate under royal guard. The decision was framed as a short medical retreat for the child, endorsed by physicians who could not deny the evidence in their charts. Officially, it was about rest and stability. In reality, it was Adrian choosing the child over the theater. Julian felt the shift the moment they left the palace gates behind. The air in the car changed. The guards were still present, but their vigilance felt purposeful, not performative. Leon's breathing eased as the city fell away. He curled against Julian's side, and finally, for the first time in days, fell asleep without jerking awake. Julian stared out the window at the passing trees and understood something he had not allowed himself to believe. In Adrian's world, protection was not always a cage. Sometimes it was a declaration in the best sense of the word, a line drawn so cleanly it could not be misunderstood. No one touches what I refuse to lose. The countryside estate should have been quiet. It wasn't. The silence there had weight, the kind that pressed against the ears and made every small sound feel intentional. Tires whispered over gravel. A distant fountain breathed water into stone. Somewhere far off, a dog barked once and stopped, as if remembering rules. The air smelled of wet earth and trimmed hedges, too clean to be natural. Julian recognized the place before the car fully slowed, not by architecture, not by the neat symmetry of the main building, not by the expensive calm of the grounds. He recognized it by the way his stomach tightened into a hard knot, the way his hands went cold on his knees, the way his body shouted warning before his mind could form a sentence. The road curved left in a particular way, bending around a stand of trees that leaned as if they had grown under constant wind. An old stone gate waited ahead, pale in the dusk, carved with a crest Julian could not name but felt he had seen. Beyond it, a narrow service path ran behind the greenhouse, half hidden by shrubs. Julian's eyes caught that path, and his breath stuttered. It was the same curve, the same gate, the same small path that led into darkness and memory. The realization hit like an electric shock. Julian's mind tried to reject it, to smear it into coincidence, but his body was already screaming that this was where the missing year began. This was where a drenched child had clung to him in a storm. This was where men without names had taken that child with gentle efficiency. This was where paperwork had replaced truth. Julian's throat tightened. He tasted metal. His pulse rose so fast it made his vision flicker at the edges. "No," he whispered, "not to anyone, just to the world." Leon, strapped into the back seat beside him, shifted in sleep and made a small sound that pulled Julian back into the present. The child's hand, even unconscious, drifted toward Julian's sleeve as if confirming he was still there. Julian covered Leon's fingers with his own, forcing himself to breathe slowly, forcing his body to remember now was not then. Security opened the gate. The car rolled forward, gravel crunched, lights along the drive turned on one by one like a line of eyes waking. Inside, the estate looked like peace on purpose, soft lamps, warm wood. A fire already prepared as if someone had anticipated cold. Staff moved quietly, speaking in murmurs. No one asked Julian if he recognized the place. No one mentioned storms or old files. The palace's version of mercy was always the same. It acted like the past did not exist. Julian carried Leon upstairs anyway. Leon's arms wrapped around his neck, heavy with exhaustion. The child's breath warmed Julian's skin. Julian laid him in a wide bed with crisp sheets and a blanket that smelled faintly of lavender. Leon curled immediately toward Julian's side, as if the mattress itself was dangerous without him. Julian sat on the edge of the bed until Leon's breathing steadied. He watched the child's eyelashes flutter, watched the tension in his small shoulders ease in slow increments. The sight should have softened Julian. Instead, it sharpened the fear, because if this was the place, then the past had not been left behind. It had been stored. That night, Leon had a nightmare. It hit suddenly, like a wave from deep water. Leon's body jerked. His eyes snapped open with panic already in them. He made a sound that was not quite a cry, more like a strangled inhale. He reached for Julian with blind urgency, pressing his face into Julian's shoulder, as if trying to hide inside him. Julian wrapped both arms around him and held on. He felt Leon shaking. He felt the child's heart hammering against his own ribs. Julian rocked slowly, whispering the only truth he had. "You're here," he breathed. "You're safe." Leon's fingers clenched Julian's shirt until the fabric twisted. His breath came in ragged bursts, then slowly, painfully began to smooth. The child did not speak. He didn't need to. His body said everything. The nightmare had been older than the day, older than headlines. It had been memory without language. When Leon finally fell asleep again, slack with exhaustion, Julian eased out of the bed and stepped into the corridor. The hallway was dim, lined with portraits that watched without warmth. Julian walked as if he might wake the walls. His feet carried him toward the stairs without conscious choice, drawn by the need to understand what his body already knew. He turned a corner and saw Adrian. The crown prince stood alone in a sitting room with a single lamp on, the rest of the space drowned in shadow. He was fully awake, dressed in a dark shirt with sleeves rolled up, hair slightly disordered in a way Julian had never seen at the academy. In his hands was a folder thick with old reports, paper edges worn as if they had been handled too often. Adrian did not look surprised to see him. It was as if he had been waiting for Julian to come out into the night. Julian's voice came out rough. "This place." Adrian's gaze held him, steady and heavy. He nodded once, small and final. The prince had been investigating quietly for months, not Julian's behavior as a teacher, not the reception footage, not the rumors. He had been tracing the origin of Leon's bond to Julian. The storm night, the missing records, the sealed files, the erased camera logs, the parts of the palace that pretended to be clean. Adrian opened the folder and slid a page forward. Julian saw lines of text, official stamps, dates written in formal language. He saw portions blacked out. He saw a location code that made his stomach twist because it matched the curve of the road outside. Adrian's jaw tightened as his finger tapped a name, the head of palace security from that era. Now, a powerful court advisor. A man whose public career was built on the phrase, "protecting the royal family," repeated like prayer. A man whose private connections, Adrian's file suggested, braided into discreet operations that smelled like black market control, like quiet trafficking routes, like omega bodies treated as commodities. Julian stared at the name until the letters blurred. His lungs refused to fill properly. "It wasn't random," Julian whispered, and felt his voice break on the last word. Adrian's voice came low, controlled, but it carried something raw underneath. "No," the room seemed to tilt. Julian's memory flashed in fragments, rain on metal, a blanket around small shoulders, men without names, a pen pressed into his hand. He had told himself it was a random crisis, a random child, a random night, but Leon's terror, Leon's relief at the word father, Leon's nightmares in this very building, all of it pointed to a different truth. Julian's trauma was not random. Leon's storm night was not an accident. Julian realized the boy had not called him father because he was mistaken. He had called him father because Julian had been the first adult who chose him without agenda, without politics, without bloodline arithmetic. And someone had tried to erase that bond for convenience. Someone had tried to edit a child's survival into a footnote. Outside the window, the countryside looked peaceful. Moonlight on trees, a neat line of hedges, still air. Inside, the estate felt like a crime scene that had been cleaned too well. Julian's hands trembled as he pressed his palm against the back of a chair to steady himself. His throat burned. He forced the words out anyway, small and terrible. They did this. Adrian's gaze didn't waver. In it, Julian saw the shape of a war beginning, not loud yet, but inevitable. And in the next room, beyond the corridor, Prince Leon slept with his fist curled around the edge of Julian's sleeve, holding on as if instinct had always known the truth. Adrian moved like someone trained for war without uniforms. In the countryside estate, he did not raise his voice. He did not slam doors. He did not storm into rooms demanding confession. He carried the knowledge like a blade kept sheathed, and he used it the way his bloodline had taught him, with patience, with timing, with the kind of restraint that looked polite until it became lethal. He did not confront the advisor directly. A direct confrontation would have given the man what he wanted: a spectacle, a chance to frame Adrian as unstable, emotional, compromised by scandal. Instead, Adrian mapped the court the way soldiers map terrain. He identified who owed the advisor favors, who feared him, who hated him quietly, who would abandon him the moment a safer anchor appeared. Adrian pulled archived records through legal channels that looked innocent, requests framed as routine audits, security reviews justified by public threat escalation, medical consults for Leon that conveniently required access to old incident logs. Each document arrived with stamps and signatures that made it hard to refuse without exposing refusal as guilt. He worked the press strategically, but never fed them Julian's life as meat. Carefully placed leaks did not mention an Omega teacher or a scandalous word in a ballroom. They mentioned irregularities in palace security procedures, budget anomalies, missing camera logs from a past year. The kinds of stories journalists could sell without needing Julian as the headline. Adrian understood hunger. He simply redirected it. He reassigned security units quietly, like shifting chess pieces. Guards loyal to the advisor found themselves moved to ceremonial posts far from Leon. New teams rotated into the estate, chosen for competence and low political attachment. The advisor's access tightened without anyone announcing the tightening. The palace machine kept running. Only the hidden gears changed. Julian watched all of this with a mixture of awe and dread. He was fighting a different war. He fought the shame of being useful only when a child needed him. It crept in during quiet moments when staff addressed him with polite neutrality and then turned to Adrian for every real decision. It whispered that his value was temporary, conditional, measurable. He fought the fear that once Leon stabilized, the palace would discard him like a solved problem. He fought the instinct to run, the Omega survival reflex that urged disappearance before the world decided what he was. The estate made it easier to breathe and harder to relax. The threats felt farther away, but the future felt closer, looming. Julian slept lightly, waking at small sounds, listening for footsteps outside Leon's door. He checked his suppressants twice a day. He monitored Leon's moods as if they were weather signs. He tried to act normal while knowing nothing about his life was normal anymore. The palace doctors recommended therapy, delivered as kindness with a clipboard. The palace lawyers recommended silence, delivered as protection with warning edges. The palace advisors recommended distancing Julian from Leon to normalize the child, delivered as reason that pretended not to be cruelty. Julian heard those recommendations and felt cold settle under his skin. Normalize meant detach. Detach meant break a bond the child's body had built for survival. Julian had watched Leon's panic return after a single separation. He had felt the way the boy clung, as if the world became unsafe the moment Julian's scent disappeared. Adrian rejected all three recommendations in the only way a crown prince could. He did nothing to signal agreement and everything to make them irrelevant. Therapy was scheduled, but the therapist was one Adrian chose, bound by stricter confidentiality than palace protocol. Silence was maintained publicly, but Adrian's legal teams prepared filings behind closed doors that made silence less a surrender and more a trap set for the right moment. Distancing was suggested, but Adrian ordered Leon's care plan rewritten by physicians who could not ignore their own data, making Julian's presence an officially endorsed medical necessity. Leon began to bond with Adrian more openly during this period, but only with Julian present. It happened in small, fragile steps. A glance held longer. A toy rolled toward Adrian again, less like a test and more like an invitation. A brief moment when Leon's hand touched Adrian's sleeve and did not immediately withdraw. The child's nervous system accepted the crown prince as safe when Julian's calm anchored the room. Adrian adapted with discipline that startled Julian. The prince learned to breathe slower, to soften his shoulders, to keep his scent controlled and non-pressuring, to sit lower, to make his presence smaller, to let the child come near without being pulled. There were moments Julian caught Adrian watching Leon with an expression that had no place in official portraiture. something fierce and almost grief-shaped. Julian understood then that Adrian's restraint was not indifference. It was fear of doing harm. Julian watched Adrian change in increments so subtle they could have been imagined and realized something that frightened him more than scandal. Adrian was becoming the kind of alpha Julian could love, not the kind who rescued Omegas to feel heroic, not the kind who claimed gratitude as ownership, the kind who did the hard thing because it was right, even when it made him bleed politically, the kind who used power not to consume, but to shield. Julian tried to crush the thought the moment it formed. Love was dangerous. Love was leverage. Love was how the palace would destroy him if it ever became visible. Then the advisor struck back. He did it the way men like him always did, by turning the vulnerable into weapons. A dossier leaked to the media, twisted facts, selective dates written in clean lines that looked official. The missing year in Julian's past framed as criminal behavior, as deceit, as evidence of infiltration. Old photos resurfaced with false captions. A clipped version of the reception video ran with commentary that turned Julian's startled expression into guilt. The narrative was rewritten until Julian looked like a predator, not a protector. Julian saw the headline on a staff member's screen by accident and felt his stomach drop so violently he nearly vomited. His hands shook. His throat closed. "I'm done," he whispered, to no one, the words tearing out of him like a plea. "I can't." He stopped himself because Leon was in the room, watching. Children sensed fear like smoke. The palace reacted with predictable speed. They demanded Julian be removed from Leon immediately for the child's safety. They framed it as urgent, responsible, necessary. They spoke as if public perception was the same thing as truth. They used the dossier as justification, pretending it was evidence rather than a weapon. Julian felt the old panic surge, that instinct to vanish before the cage door shut. He imagined Leon waking in the night, reaching for him and finding only air. He imagined the child's body returning to shaking terror. He imagined being blamed for the damage after being forcibly removed. Adrian received the demand and did not flinch. For a long moment he stood very still, as if letting the palace's threat settle in his bones. Then he looked at Julian, and Julian saw something shift behind the prince's eyes. The careful restraint did not vanish, but it sharpened into something else. A decision. Adrian's voice came low, controlled, and final, the kind of tone that made guards straighten without understanding why. "No." One syllable, and the room changed. Julian felt it like a temperature drop. The palace could push, the court advisor could smear, but Adrian was done letting other people write the story. For the first time, Julian understood what Adrian was preparing to do. He was preparing to set the palace on fire with the truth. Adrian chose an official event to end the war. He could have done it quietly, through sealed court filings and private removals, the way palaces preferred to clean their stains. But quiet endings left room for resurrection. Quiet endings let predators survive in other rooms. Adrian wanted the advisor's power broken where power lived, in public belief, in ceremony, in the gaze of cameras that could turn a person into a myth or a corpse. So he chose another reception. It was larger than the first, designed for diplomacy and optics, built to make the monarchy look unshakable. The hall was brighter, the guest list heavier with foreign officials, donors, and courtiers who wore their allegiance like jewelry. Cameras were everywhere, more professional this time, positioned to catch every angle. The palace wanted control back. Adrian used their stage as a blade. Julian was told to stay away. The message arrived in polite language, framed as protection. But Julian heard the truth underneath it. If he did not appear, the palace could erase him more easily. If he stayed hidden, the narrative could be rewritten without his face contradicting it. If he obeyed, Leon would enter the hall alone, and the court could claim the child was improving without that dangerous Omega presence. Julian refused, not because he wanted attention. Attention had already skinned him raw. He refused because Leon's stability had a face, and Julian would not let the palace pretend that face was harmful without standing there to be seen. He refused because silence had already stolen 1 year of his life, and he could not endure losing another by compliance. Leon arrived holding Julian's hand, surrounded by security that moved with unnatural precision. The child walked into the hall not like a prop, not like a symbol, but like someone who had already survived storms. He looked smaller than the chandeliers, smaller than the marble, smaller than the political machine built around him, yet he moved with stubborn purpose, fingers locked around Julian's as if the world could not separate them by force. The hall noticed immediately. A ripple ran through the crowd, the same turning of heads as the first reception, but sharper now, weaponized by weeks of rumor. Julian felt eyes land on him like thrown stones. He felt the invisible pressure of scent recognition, the way alphas read omegas without permission. His suppressed sense held, but stress still trembled beneath his skin, making him feel too visible. The advisor watched from across the room with the patience of a predator waiting for shame to do its work. He stood among traditionalists who wore outrage like righteousness. His expression was composed, almost sympathetic, as if he pitied the crown prince for being compromised. Julian recognized the type instantly, men who never looked guilty because they believed guilt was for lesser people. Leon's grip tightened. Julian lowered his head slightly, breathing slow, anchoring the child with rhythm rather than words. "I'm here," he whispered, and felt Leon's shoulders loosen by a fraction. Then Adrian entered. The crown prince moved through the hall with a calm that carried authority the way gravity carried weight. Conversations softened around him, bodies shifted to make space without being asked. His face was controlled, suitable for portraits, but Julian saw something underneath it in the way Adrian's gaze cut across the room. He had not come to negotiate. He had come to end something. Adrian began with ceremony, because ceremony was how the palace listened. He greeted diplomats. He spoke about stability, duty, transparency, the welfare of the royal family. The words were polished enough to satisfy foreign cameras. The tone was measured, the smile minimal. Then he changed the temperature. He did not raise his voice. He did not announce a confrontation. He simply introduced what he called an overdue clarification, delivered in the clean language of governance. An aide stepped forward with packets. Another carried a tablet. A security officer adjusted position near the advisor without touching him, yet making him suddenly less free. Julian realized with a cold thrill that Adrian had organized every detail. Who stood where, which cameras had clear lines, which diplomats would later confirm what they witnessed, which officials had been quietly briefed so they could not pretend surprise. Adrian released a controlled set of documents in front of the cameras and the court, sealed reports from the storm night, records of internal manipulation, logs showing missing footage and altered timelines, medical notes confirming Leon's distress when separated from safe contact, internal directives that reframed a child's well-being as a political containment strategy, evidence that the advisor's office had ordered, facilitated, or covered actions that treated Omega bodies as commodities under the veil of palace security. The court could deny rumors. It could not deny paperwork. Julian watched faces shift as pages turned. He watched foreign officials glance at one another in that careful way diplomats did when they realized they had witnessed something that would be written into history. He watched courtiers who had once stood close to the advisor take half steps away, as if distance could cleanse them. The advisor's face did not crack, his power did. For a moment he looked almost bored, as if the evidence was a mild inconvenience. Then Julian saw the first true change. The advisor's eyes flickered toward the exits, calculating. Security had already closed those exits with bodies rather than locks. Leon made a small sound, not quite fear, not quite relief. Julian felt the child press closer, the same instinctive seeking of safety. Julian's own hands shook, not from panic, but from a strange grief that rose like floodwater. Grief for the years stolen by silence, grief for the part of his life that had been erased for convenience, grief for the fact that truth always arrived too late and still demanded payment. Leon clung to him again, but this time it was not scandal, it was proof. The cameras captured it from every angle, the child prince holding the Omega teacher's hand as if it were a lifeline, while the crown prince dismantled a court predator with documents and timing. The world watched live. The narrative, which had been fed for weeks like a monster, began to change shape in real time. Julian was no longer only a suspicious Omega teacher in a viral clip. He was the reason a prince had survived a storm night that should have swallowed him, and the reason a crown prince finally stopped pretending the palace was innocent. In the weeks that followed, the palace tried to recover the way palaces always did. It announced investigations with carefully chosen words. It promised reforms that sounded brave and bloodless at the same time. It replaced officials with new faces that wore the same posture. It issued statements polished until they reflected nothing human back. The monarchy behaved like a machine that had suffered a public malfunction and now wanted to reassure the world it was still flawless. But inside the family, something more important happened. Leon stopped waking up screaming. It did not happen overnight. The nightmares loosened in stages, like a fist slowly unclenching. First, the waking panics became shorter. Then, they became less frequent. Then, there were mornings when Julian realized, with a shock of gratitude, that Leon had slept through the entire night without searching for air with his hands. The child began to eat without flinching at every sound. He began to play with a looseness that had been missing, as if his body finally believed the floor would stay under him. He started laughing the way children laughed when they trusted tomorrow would arrive safely. Not the careful laughter of a child performing for adults, but the sudden, messy kind that made his whole face brighten. Julian found himself standing in doorways just to watch it, because the sound felt like proof that survival could turn into life again. Leon began calling Adrian a brother more openly. At first it was hesitant, half-formed, like a word tested for sharp edges. Leon watched Adrian closely each time, measuring reaction. Adrian never demanded it, never reacted like it was a trophy. He simply accepted the word with quiet steadiness, as if it were normal to be earned rather than owed. Over time, Leon stopped watching so hard. He began to approach Adrian without checking Julian's face first. He offered toys. He climbed onto the same sofa. He leaned against Adrian's arm for a second longer before pulling away. The Crown Prince learned to move at Leon's pace. He softened in ways that would never appear in official photos. He sat on the floor without caring what courtiers would think. He let Leon's small hands tug at his sleeve. He learned to read when the child needed space and when the child needed presence. He stopped trying to look unbreakable and started trying to look safe. Julian remained what he had always been, steady, observant, gentle in the way survival taught gentleness, but now his steadiness was recognized as value, not weakness. The palace could not pretend he was a contaminant anymore, not with medical records and public evidence tying Leon's stability to Julian's presence. Advisors tried to rename the bond into something sterile, something manageable. Guardian, mentor, stability figure. Words designed to avoid the one word the cameras loved. Words designed to keep Julian in a category that did not threaten tradition. Julian accepted the titles because he understood the game. Names were tools here. But in the quiet spaces, when Leon woke from a dream and reached for him, the child still used the word the heart chose. "Father," Leon whispered once in the dark, voice thick with sleep. Julian's chest tightened so hard he had to press his palm against it. "I'm here," he whispered back because he had no safer answer. Adrian did not rush Julian. The prince understood something most alphas in power forgot. Love was not a prize Omega bodies owed alphas. Love was permission. It was earned through consistent, quiet safety. Adrian earned it the way he did everything that mattered, with discipline turned toward care instead of control. He respected Julian's boundaries without sulking. He never used his position to corner Julian into gratitude. He arranged security so Julian could walk in the gardens without feeling watched like prey. He blocked courtiers who tried to insinuate themselves into Leon's care plan. He refused to let the court touch Julian through bureaucracy the way it had tried to touch him through rumor. When Julian's contract with the academy was formally terminated, it arrived as a clean administrative letter that pretended the past months were merely inconvenient. His position was replaced, his classroom assigned to someone else, his name removed from staff lists. His old apartment sat empty, keys still in a drawer, as if his former life had simply been paused and abandoned. Julian expected to feel destroyed. Instead, he felt unhidden. His quiet life was gone, yes. The small safety of anonymity had burned away. But in its place was something he had never allowed himself to want: A life where he did not have to apologize for existing, where his presence was not a secret, where the bond he had built was no longer treated as a stain. He accepted a new role as an education advisor for Palace youth programs, not as a symbol, not as a headline, but as a professional who understood what trauma did to children and what stability could repair. He attended meetings with doctors and counselors, reviewed protocols, designed routines that made the palace less sharp for the youngest members trapped inside it. He spoke calmly and firmly, the same teacher voice he had used in classrooms, only now the stakes were not grades but nervous systems. Leon remained in his care by medical recommendation and legal decree. The documents called it best interest. The palace called it necessary. The court called it embarrassing. Leon called it home. Adrian, now openly protective, no longer pretended indifference toward the Omega who had become the axis of his brother's healing. He stood beside Julian in public, with deliberate calm. He allowed cameras to capture them, not as scandal, but as structure. He made it clear with posture alone that Julian was not an intruder to be removed, but a person under royal protection. Not because Julian belonged to him, but because harm would no longer be permitted. Somewhere along the way, Julian began to breathe without bracing. He still woke early out of habit, but the mornings felt different. Leon would pad into the kitchen with sleep in his eyes and climb into a chair. Adrian would arrive in the doorway with a file under his arm, pause and watch them for a moment longer than duty required. In that pause lived a quiet tenderness the palace could not legislate. Julian's life had begun with a child clinging to him in a hall full of cameras. It had continued with a crown prince who chose truth over comfort, and it had become a family the palace did not know how to label, which, for once, meant it was real. "If you're here," Julian murmured once, watching Leon laugh. "Then we made it." Adrian's voice came low, almost careful, as if he treated the moment like something fragile. "We did." And for the first time in a long time, Julian believed tomorrow would arrive safely too.